I arrived at the corporate party unannounced, determined to surprise my wife. The event was luxurious, filled with well-dressed people who chatted over glasses of champagne and hushed laughter. The low lighting and soft music created a cozy, almost perfect atmosphere. But something was wrong. I didn't know what, I just felt it, like a shadow crawling over me. I walked around the room, trying to ignore the discomfort, until I saw them. She was there, my wife, laughing at something another man had said, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in a while. He held her waist with an intimacy that cannot be disguised. For a moment I stood frozen, my body heavy, my eyes fixed on them. Her every laugh cut like a sharp blade. And then, they walked away, discreetly, almost as if they didn't want to attract attention, but were calling for that very reason. My feet moved before my mind could react. I followed them down a narrow corridor, where no one seemed to be paying attention. The door at the end of the corridor was opened by him, and she entered first. I knew I should turn away, turn my back and walk away, but I was unable to. The silence in that hallway was deafening as I approached. I pushed the door. The air inside felt heavier, almost suffocating. They walked away quickly, as if the distance between their bodies could erase what I had just witnessed. Her gaze, of surprise and guilt, met mine. He, on the other hand, looked more uncomfortable than remorseful. She started to speak, stuttering something about a misinterpreted situation, but the truth was already there, printed, raw and undeniable. It wasn't just what I saw, but what I felt. Betrayal doesn't begin with the moment of touch, but with the intention, and their intention was clear. You don't need to explain yourself. I already understood everything. My words came out cold, hard as stone, while my chest felt like it was on fire. She tried to argue, tears started to fall down her face, but none of them moved me. He, the other, looked uncomfortable, as if he wanted to evaporate. But I wouldn't let it. I knew who he was, what he was doing there. It wasn't just any man, it was someone who knew my routine, who knew where to attack. The betrayal was methodical, planned. This made everything even more unbearable. People were starting to realize something. Murmurs arose in the distance, curious eyes peered through the half-open door. Her mask of a devoted and perfect wife was beginning to crack. The look of panic on his face revealed the fear that everything we had built, our life, our reputation, our marriage, was about to fall apart. But for me, there was already noise. I left the room without looking back. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the hall as my thoughts screamed louder than any music or conversation around. Every moment of our wedding played like a movie in my mind, the vows exchanged, the promises made, the plans for the future. Every memory was now dead weight, a lie I could no longer carry. The night, however, was far from over. As I tried to process what I had seen, I realized I wasn't the only one carrying secrets. The party continued, but the buzz about what had happened began to grow. Friends and colleagues gave me inquisitive looks, but I ignored them, focused on something bigger. I needed to understand the extent of the damage. There were messages, emails, little details that started to make sense. The pieces of the puzzle of betrayal were coming together, revealing what I had previously been too blind to see. She came to see me later, at home. His face marked by tears and his voice hoarse from trying so hard to justify himself. I made a mistake. It was a moment of weakness. Please give me a chance to explain. But I didn't want explanations. The pain was too deep to be healed by words. You know what hurts the most? It's not just the fact that you did it. It's the fact that while I was trying hard to be the best husband, you were trying hard to be the worst wife possible. She tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand. Don't talk. Not now. I need time to think about what's left of this here. If there's anything left. That night, alone, the memories continued to haunt me. And then, an idea started to form, something that I knew would change everything. It wasn't enough to finish. It wasn't enough to move forward. They needed to understand what it was like to lose everything, like I did. And that's how my plan began. It wouldn't be quick, nor easy. But it would be fair. While she slept in the guest room, I began to investigate. And what I discovered was even worse than I imagined. It wasn't the first time it had happened, and he wasn't the only one. Her pattern of lies and betrayals was meticulously hidden, but now I had all the tools to expose the truth. And him? Well, he wasn't as immaculate as he liked to seem. His professional life, his reputation, everything was about to fall apart. And I would be the catalyst. Looking out the window that morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. For the first time, I was in charge. And no matter how much time or effort it took, I was determined to show them what it meant to play with the heart of someone who just wanted to be loved. When morning came, the plan was already in motion. And I knew that when everything was revealed, they would bitterly regret every choice they made. Because sometimes the worst punishment isn't losing what you have, but facing the consequences of what you did to get it. Welcome to our channel, where intense stories come to life. Here, we never support or encourage any type of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional and have a clear objective: to show how betrayal can destroy lives, hearts, and trust. Get ready, because today's story is shocking, full of twists and turns and lessons you will never forget. Now, sit back and dive into this plot that will hold your attention from beginning to end. Good story. Lucas and Clara were the type of couple who, at first glance, seemed to have everything under control. They had been together for over 10 years, and those who knew them saw them as a model of stability. He, a respected sales manager, with a discreet charm and an easy smile. She, a literature teacher, with an almost palpable sensitivity and a passion for words that overflowed in everything she did. Together, they had built a comfortable life, without excessive luxuries, but with everything they needed to be happy. The house they lived in was simple but cozy, with walls painted in light tones and decorated with paintings that Clara loved to choose from local art fairs. Every detail reflected her taste, while Lucas brought practical functionality to the home. He liked to say that Clara brought color to his life, and she smiled, saying that he was her balance. The days were filled with a routine that, although predictable, was safe. During the week, Lucas left early for work, while Clara divided her time between classes and time at home, where she enjoyed taking care of the garden and writing poems that she rarely showed to anyone. Their marriage seemed solid, but like any long relationship, there were challenges that only the two of them knew about. Clara sometimes felt suffocated by a feeling of monotony, as if her life had become a sequence of identical days, without surprises. Lucas, on the other hand, was increasingly focused on work. He tried hard to get promotions that could guarantee an even better future for both of them, but, in this effort, he failed to notice that Clara felt increasingly distant. Despite this, both had a complicity that withstood the ups and downs, or at least that was what they believed. The scenario in which they lived seemed to conspire to reinforce the stability they appeared to have. The neighborhood was quiet, full of houses with well-kept gardens, where neighbors greeted each other as they passed on the sidewalk. On weekends, the couple had the habit of walking through the park near their home, where they discussed light matters or simply remained silent, enjoying each other's company. Clara fondly remembered how these walks had been an important part of the beginning of their relationship, when she was still enchanted by the way Lucas always seemed to know what to say. But time, as always, brings changes. Lucas began accepting more commitments at work, often needing to travel during the week. Clara, although understanding, felt his absence in an increasingly painful way. She filled her days with her usual activities, but the emptiness that set in at night when he wasn't home was hard to ignore. Sometimes, she found herself rereading old messages between them, seeking comfort that seemed increasingly distant. Lucas, in turn, also felt the distance, but in a different way. He was convinced that his effort at work was proof of the love he felt for Clara. He believed that securing a comfortable financial future was the greatest gift he could give her. He didn't see that in doing so he was sacrificing something even more important, his presence. Quick calls at the end of the day and hurried kisses in the morning have become poor substitutes for the deep conversations and gestures of affection that were once so frequent. Still, they kept trying. Clara sometimes left notes around the house, little reminders of love that Lucas read with a smile on his face before leaving. He, in turn, tried to make up for her absence with occasional gifts, such as a new book or dinner at a restaurant that Clara mentioned she liked. But these gestures, although well-intentioned, did not bridge the gap between the two. Their social life was also limited. Clara had some friends with whom she kept in touch, but, in general, she liked to spend her free time alone. Lucas, on the other hand, was immersed in a network of professional contacts that demanded his constant attention. Corporate events started to become frequent, something that Clara thought was unnecessary, but never said out loud. She preferred to avoid conflict by keeping her opinions to herself, while Lucas saw these events as an essential part of his job. In one of these events, something began to change, although Clara didn't realize it yet. Lucas met new colleagues and found himself in situations where he needed to socialize more than he would have liked. He was never the type of man to seek attention outside of his marriage, but sometimes the light, relaxed conversations at events felt like an escape from the heaviness he felt at home. Clara, on the other hand, began to wonder if she was doing enough to keep her marriage interesting. She blamed herself for no longer being the vibrant, energetic woman Lucas had known. The days continued to pass, and what was once just a slight tension began to become more evident. Clara noticed that Lucas was more distracted when he was at home, while he noticed that she seemed less interested in stories about her work. They both felt like something was changing, but neither knew how to start the conversation that could change the course of things. It was as if they were both trapped in a game of silence, where each waited for the other to take the initiative. Clara, with her sensitivity, tried to find clues in Lucas' gestures, while he, with his practical logic, expected Clara to simply tell him what was wrong. In essence, they both wanted the same thing, to find a way to reconnect. But the gap between wanting and doing seemed too big. It was in this context that their story began to unfold in ways neither of them could have predicted. The decisions they would make in the following days would not only be consequences of their actions, but also reflections of the choices they had made over the years. And as they continued to live their routines, not knowing what was to come, fate was preparing to test everything they believed about love, loyalty and forgiveness. Lucas began to notice a subtle change in Clara's routine, something he couldn't define clearly, but which aroused concern in him. She was more distracted, spent more time on the phone, and sometimes seemed distant even when they were in the same room. He didn't want to give vent to paranoia, so he convinced himself that they were just reflections of the small tensions he had been experiencing. In turn, Clara tried to mask her own dissatisfaction with small gestures of kindness, such as preparing Lucas's favorite dishes or letting him choose the films to watch together. But the connection that was once natural now felt forced, a piece out of place in a puzzle they no longer knew how to put together. Lucas, immersed in his work routine, had no idea what was happening outside his sight. He trusted Clara, always had, and that trust made him push away any darker thoughts. However, he began to notice something different about the corporate events he attended. Vague comments from colleagues, lingering glances and muffled laughter seemed to carry a weight he couldn't decipher. People were always respectful towards him, but there was something in the air, a discomfort that he couldn't explain. He chose to ignore it, believing it was just a result of the stress he was experiencing at work. While Lucas dedicated himself more and more to his job, Clara found a kind of escape in a new friendship. Enrique, a co-worker who seemed to understand his concerns in a way that Lucas could not. Enrique was charismatic, always ready with a joke or a word of support, and Clara felt comfortable in his presence. What started as casual conversations between colleagues soon turned into frequent meetings for lunch or coffee. Enrique listened to Clara like no one else, and she, lacking attention, found herself attracted to this closeness. But deep down, I knew I was crossing a dangerous line. One night, while Lucas was working late, Clara received a message from Enrique. He was at a nearby bar and was inviting her to join him. She hesitated, looking at her phone with her heart racing. She knew she should refuse, that she should be at home waiting for Lucas, but the feeling of emptiness that had accompanied her for so long seemed unbearable. Against his better reason, he decided to go. Upon arriving at the bar, Enrique welcomed her with a warm smile, and Clara felt her defenses crumble. They talked for hours, laughing and sharing confidences that Clara never had the courage to share with Lucas. When the night ended, Enrique walked her to the car, and the kiss they exchanged was the point of no return. Clara returned home loaded with guilt. Lucas was already asleep, and she lay down next to him with a heavy heart. She promised herself that it would never happen again, but the promise was fragile. Henry continued to look for her, and Clara, even reluctantly, gave in more and more to temptation. They began to meet more frequently, always in discreet places, away from known eyes. Clara was experiencing a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, torn between guilt and desire, between the comfort of stability and the excitement of the forbidden. Lucas, on the other hand, began to notice more obvious changes. Clara seemed more absent, her smile didn't have the same shine, and excuses to leave the house were becoming more frequent. He didn't want to confront her directly, but he felt something was wrong. One night, while Clara was out, Lucas decided to clean her closet, a task he had been putting off for a long time. Among clothes and books, he found a small envelope with tickets for an event she never mentioned. Enrique's name on the envelope meant nothing to Lucas, but the absence of any explanation for those tickets made him uneasy. Not knowing what to do, Lucas decided to continue with his routine. He tried to ignore the accumulating evidence, but the uneasiness grew every day. He began to pay more attention to Clara's schedule, to the small details that previously went unnoticed. It was during one of these observations that he noticed that she frequently exchanged messages on the phone, smiling in a way he hadn't seen in months. That hurt more than he wanted to admit, but Lucas still refused to believe the worst. He convinced himself that it was just his imagination, that everything was fine and that he just needed to be more present. The situation reached a critical point at the corporate party that Lucas organized. It was an important event, attended by colleagues and superiors, and he insisted that Clara accompany him. She hesitated, but ended up accepting. During the party, Lucas noticed that Clara seemed uncomfortable, her gaze wandered around the room as if looking for something or someone. He tried to ignore it, but he couldn't help but notice when Henry entered the room. Clara became visibly tense, and Lucas, although he didn't know exactly what was happening, felt the weight of that interaction. He watched from a distance as Clara and Enrique exchanged smiles and quick words, as if they shared a secret that excluded everything else. Later that night, Lucas went in search of Clara, who had disappeared from the salon. He found her in a corridor near the garden, talking to Enrique in a way that seemed too intimate to be just friendship. Lucas's heart raced, and he couldn't contain the urge to confront them. As he approached, he heard fragments of the conversation that left no doubt about what was happening. The betrayal he feared but refused to admit was now undeniable. Lucas stopped for a moment, his body paralyzed by the mixture of anger, pain and disbelief. Clara and Enrique noticed his presence, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any words. Lucas's gaze met Clara's, and her guilty expression said more than any explanation could. He felt the weight of betrayal crush him, as if the entire ground beneath his feet had disappeared. Without saying a word, Lucas turned and left the place, leaving Clara and Enrique behind. The party continued, but for Lucas, everything had changed. He knew that nothing would be the same again, but he also knew that this was not the last page of that story. Something was about to happen, something that would change not only the course of their lives, but also the meaning of everything they had built together. Lucas spent days immersed in a whirlwind of emotions that consumed him from the inside out. The image of Clara and Enrique in the party hallway seemed to be recorded in his mind, repeating itself incessantly, as if it were a scene from a movie that he couldn't pause. With each replay, he felt anger, sadness and a strange sense of loss that left him feeling helpless. He didn't know how or where to start putting the pieces together. Despite this, something inside him told him that it wasn't just what he had seen that night that needed to be confronted. There was more, a truth that was still hidden, something that he was beginning to feel like a shadow hanging over everything. Clara tried to contact us several times in the days that followed. Messages, calls, notes left on the table, all attempts to justify or perhaps minimize what had happened. But Lucas wasn't ready to listen. He needed answers, but not the ones Clara seemed willing to give. His head was buzzing with possibilities, each one more painful than the last. Until, on impulse, he decided to look for it on his own. It was time to find out what was being hidden. Lucas started with the obvious: social media, the messages on Clara's phone that he had glimpsed in recent months. With a heavy heart, he found more than he expected. It wasn't just exchanges of words between her and Enrique. There were meetings recorded and partially deleted messages, a call history that indicated that the relationship between them had lasted more than just a few weeks. Every detail was like a blow, tearing away pieces of her confidence and leaving in its place a wound that seemed impossible to heal. One night, while Clara was away, he found something that would change everything. Among papers kept in the office, Lucas found a confidentiality contract signed by Clara and Enrique. He couldn't immediately understand what it meant, but the document, loaded with detailed clauses and legal jargon, was clear about one thing: there was money involved. A lot of money. Lucas felt his stomach turn. It wasn't just an emotional betrayal, but something that involved manipulation and interests that he couldn't even process. He knew he needed answers, and this time, Clara wouldn't be able to escape. When Clara arrived that night, she found Lucas sitting in the living room, the contract in hand. His gaze was different, filled with something she hadn't seen since the beginning of it all. He didn't just look hurt, he seemed determined. Clara stopped at the entrance, her hand still on the doorknob, and tried to mumble something, but Lucas interrupted her, his voice low, controlled, but full of tension. He held the contract in the air, as if it were irrefutable proof. "What is this, Clara? I want to hear from you. I don't want excuses, I don't want half-truths. I want to know everything. Now." She hesitated, her eyes moving between the paper and Lucas's face, as if she were trying to calculate a way out. But his tone left no room for evasions. Clara sat down slowly, her hands shaking. For a moment, silence took over the room, until she began to speak, her voice low, almost a whisper. "Lucas. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't want you to find out like this." Lucas interrupted, anger finally escaping like a pent-up storm. "So what should it be like, Clara? Should I continue living like an idiot, believing you were the woman I thought you were? I need an answer. Who are you, anyway?" Clara took a deep breath, as if preparing for a dive into deep water. "Enrique and I. It wasn't just a question of feelings. He proposed something to me, something that I accepted because I was lost, Lucas. He knew this and used it against me. He offered me money, a deal. He said he needed someone who could serve as an alibi in some personal situations, things related to his work. And I accepted." Lucas felt the world around him spin. "Alibi? You're telling me you entered into some kind of agreement with him, using our marriage as a backdrop for, what exactly? Betrayals? Business?" Clara shook her head, tears beginning to flow. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. He said it would be something discreet, that no one would know. But things got out of control, Lucas. I was foolish. I thought I could handle it, but..." Lucas stood up, his eyes fixed on her, a mixture of disbelief and disgust. "You sold our lives for money, Clara. For some dirty scheme by a man who clearly doesn't care about you. And all this while I was working, believing that we were building something together." Clara tried to justify herself, but words couldn't fill the void her confession had created. Lucas, now calmer but visibly devastated, stared at her for a long moment before continuing. I spent so much time trying to understand where we were going wrong, trying to find a way to reconnect. And now I realize I was fighting alone. You had already decided, Clara. Decided I wasn't enough. The silence that followed was heavy, filled only by the tense breathing of both of them. Clara lowered her head, unable to hold Lucas's gaze as he walked away, grabbing his keys and heading out the door. She knew he needed time, but she feared that this time there would be no turning back. Lucas drove aimlessly for hours, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Clara's words echoed in his head, each sentence reopening a wound that he tried unsuccessfully to stop. The steering wheel in his hands shook under the force of his grip, while his eyes barely adjusted to the darkness of the road ahead. He wondered again and again how he hadn't realized it before, how he had allowed this to happen right before his eyes. The lies, the manipulations, and now the raw and painful truth that Clara had finally revealed. All of this consumed him. When the car finally stopped, it was in front of a small inn on the side of the road. The neon sign blinked faintly, and the place looked as empty as he felt inside. Lucas went in, booked a room without even paying attention to the conversation with the receptionist, and walked up the stairs with heavy steps. Upon entering the room, he threw himself on the bed, his body exhausted from carrying the weight of betrayal and revelations. But sleep didn't come. Instead, he stared at the ceiling, reliving every detail of what he had discovered that night. Meanwhile, Clara remained at home, alone. Sitting in the room, surrounded by an almost oppressive silence, she held the contract that Lucas had left behind. The words printed on the paper now seemed to scream at her, each clause a reminder of the choices she had made. She knew Lucas wasn't the only one who felt betrayed. She herself was drowning in guilt, unable to justify, even to herself, how she had allowed the situation to get to this point. Enrique had promised something that seemed harmless, but with each step, she found herself more involved in a web that she could no longer control. In the morning, Lucas decided that he needed clearer answers, not only from Clara, but also from Enrique. The man who had infiltrated her life, took advantage of the weaknesses in her marriage and, apparently, used Clara for purposes that went beyond a simple affair. He knew where to find Enrique, and he didn't hesitate. He drove to the office where the man worked, waiting for him at the exit. When Henry finally appeared, Lucas intercepted his path. Enrique, visibly uncomfortable, tried to act surprised, but Lucas didn't waste time with formalities. "We need to talk," said Lucas, his voice controlled, but filled with an intensity that left no room for refusal. Enrique looked around, as if looking for an escape route, but he knew he had no choice. He recommended a nearby cafe, where they could talk without attracting attention. As they sat down, Lucas got straight to the point. "You used my wife, my family, and now I want to know exactly how far this goes. Why her? Why me?" His voice was firm, but there was an underlying pain that Enrique couldn't ignore. Enrique took a deep breath, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. He knew Lucas wasn't there to accept excuses. It wasn't personal, Lucas. It was an opportunity. Clara seemed ideal for what I needed. Someone trustworthy, someone who could help me without arousing suspicion. And, well, the circumstances aligned. Lucas narrowed his eyes, anger boiling inside him. Circumstances? Have you destroyed a marriage due to circumstances? That's no excuse, Enrique. You knew exactly what you were doing. Enrique ran his hand through his hair, clearly tense. I won't deny that I made a mistake, but, believe me, Clara went into this because she felt lost. She was vulnerable, and I took advantage of that. But it wasn't just that. There are more things that you may not know. Lucas leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Enrique's face. So tell me. Now. I'm not leaving here until I know everything. Enrique hesitated, but knew he had no choice. He began to speak, revealing details about the agreement he had made with Clara, about how he had convinced her that it was something harmless, just a way to help him with his business. But over time, things had changed. What started as small favors soon became something more complex, involving money, reputations and secrets that could ruin more than one life. And you think that justifies what you did? Lucas interrupted, his voice full of contempt. You took advantage of a person who was going through a difficult time, and in the process, you destroyed something that took us years to build. Henry looked uncomfortable, but didn't try to defend himself. He knew there was no justification for what he had done. Lucas stood up, throwing some notes on the table to pay for coffee, and took one last look at Enrique. You think you've won, but you haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to fix this, one way or another. And, believe me, you will feel the weight of your choices. Back at the house, Lucas found Clara waiting for him. She looked more haggard than ever, her eyes swollen from crying. When he entered, she stood up but didn't come any closer. Lucas stared at her for a long moment before speaking. I spoke to Enrique. Now I know everything. Or at least enough. Clara swallowed, unable to hold his gaze. Lucas continued, his voice firm, but without the anger he had felt before. I don't know if I can forgive what you did, Clara. But most of all, what hurts me the most is realizing that you never trusted me enough to talk about what you were going through. You chose to hide, lie, and that. I don't know how to overcome. Clara finally found the courage to speak, her voice weak but full of emotion. I made a mistake, Lucas. I know I made a mistake. But please believe me when I say that I never wanted to hurt you. I was confused, lost, and made choices that I now deeply regret. Lucas sighed, running a hand over his face. He knew her words were sincere, but that didn't lessen the pain he felt. That doesn't change what happened, Clara. And honestly, I don't know if I can keep this up. But I know one thing, Enrique won't get away with this. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything that had been said and what still remained in the air. Lucas knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but for the first time in days, he felt like he had control over his life again. And that, at least, was a start. Lucas spent the next few days in a state of constant agitation. Although he had finally gotten the truth out of Enrique and heard Clara's excuses, the feeling of emptiness inside him seemed to grow more and more. It wasn't just the physical and emotional betrayal that tormented him, but the depth of the manipulation, the way his life had been reduced to a pawn in a game he didn't even know was being played. He needed time to understand how this had all happened and, more importantly, what he would do next. Each decision seemed fraught with consequences that he was not yet able to measure. Clara, on the other hand, looked more and more like a shadow of herself. The weight of what she had done consumed her from the inside out, and the growing distance between her and Lucas was like an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. She tried, in small ways, to repair the damage, preparing dinners, leaving notes around the house, even avoiding contact with anyone who might remind her of Enrique. But Lucas didn't respond to these attempts, his coldness was a shield that she couldn't break through. One night, Clara finally gathered the courage to try a more direct dialogue. She found Lucas sitting in the living room, staring at a photo of the two of them from a few years ago. He didn't seem to notice her presence until she spoke, her voice shaky but firm. I know words aren't enough, but I need to say that I'm sorry, Lucas. Of everything. Not just what I did, but how I let it destroy us. Lucas looked away from the photo and looked at her, his expression difficult to decipher. Repentance, Clara, does not erase what was done. It doesn't erase the lies, the choices, the consequences that came later. I don't know what you expected, but what I expected was honesty. Something we clearly didn't have. Clara approached, sitting next to him on the sofa, but keeping a safe distance. She knew that any bolder move would be rejected. I know none of this is justified, but please let me show that we can still find a way out of this. I don't want this to be the end, Lucas. We have a history, a life together, and I don't want to lose that. Lucas took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on her for a few seconds before shifting to the window. He wanted to believe that there was something to be saved, but the pain and distrust weighed more. The question, Clara, is not just what you did, but what it revealed about us. About how we allowed things to get to this point. And honestly, I don't know if I want to rebuild anything on top of so much rubble. Clara lowered her head, feeling the weight of his words like a condemnation. She knew that what she had done was unforgivable to many, but still, she had hoped that there might be a chance, however small it was. Meanwhile, Lucas began to put into practice what he had promised. He knew he couldn't just move on without doing something about Henry. The man had not only taken advantage of Clara, but also tried to use the situation for his own benefit. Lucas began to gather the information he had, messages, the contract, everything that could be used against Enrique in a legal way. He was not a man who sought revenge, but he felt he needed to put an end to this story in a way that was fair. At the same time, he started talking to a lawyer friend, seeking guidance on how to proceed with the marriage. He wasn't ready to decide about divorce yet, but he knew he needed to understand his options. The sympathetic friend listened attentively and offered practical advice, but Lucas realized that even the best legal strategy could not resolve the emotional mess his life had become. As the days went by, Lucas began to notice something strange about Clara's behavior. She seemed to be trying to reconnect with him in a more genuine way, not just with superficial gestures, but really trying to understand what he felt. One night, while they were in the kitchen, Clara broke the silence with a question that Lucas didn't expect. Do you feel there is still something in us worth saving? The question took him by surprise, and it took him a few seconds to respond. I don't know, Clara. I really don't know. There are times when I think so, but most of the time, it feels like everything is beyond repair. She nodded, as if she had already expected that answer. But instead of falling down, Clara looked at him with determination. Then let me try. I don't expect you to forgive me now, but let me show you that I'm still the person you once loved. That I can still be. Lucas remained silent, not knowing what to say. He wanted to believe it was possible, but every time he tried, the memory of betrayal came back with a vengeance. Meanwhile, Lucas' actions against Henry began to have an effect. He discovered that Enrique was not only manipulative, but also had a history of unethical behavior in his business dealings. With the help of his lawyer, Lucas managed to expose some of these practices, which resulted in an investigation that placed Enrique in a vulnerable position. It was not a personal victory that Lucas was looking for, but rather the certainty that Enrique would not continue to harm other people as he had done to Clara. When Lucas finally confronted Enrique for the last time, the man was clearly dejected. The confidence he exuded before was gone, replaced by a palpable nervousness. Lucas didn't bother to prolong the conversation, but he made it clear that he wouldn't allow Enrique to get away with it. Back home, Lucas began to notice something he hadn't expected. Despite everything, he still cared about Clara. The pain and anger were still there, but there was also a deeper feeling, something he couldn't ignore. He knew they would need time, perhaps more than he was willing to give at that moment, but he began to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance to rebuild. That night, Clara approached him in his room, not with words, but with a look that said more than any speech. They didn't speak, but the silence between them felt less heavy, as if, for the first time in weeks, there was a truce. Lucas knew he still had a long way to go, but he also knew that he was finally starting to see a glimmer of clarity amidst the chaos. Lucas made a decision the next morning, one he had been putting off for weeks. He needed closure, something that would allow him to move on, whether with Clara or alone. Recent conversations between the two had shown that, despite everything, there was still a connection. But the connection, he knew, wasn't enough to erase the betrayal, the lies, or the chasm that had opened between them. Lucas placed the contract found in Clara's office in a folder, along with all the evidence he had gathered against Enrique. He was going to finish this once and for all. When Clara entered the room, she saw Lucas already dressed, his expression serious and indecipherable. She hesitated for a moment, but asked if he needed anything. He looked at her, weighing every word he would say next. There was a coldness in his voice, but also a weariness that Clara recognized as the result of weeks of tension. "I need to wrap this up, Clara. Not just for me, but for you too. Enrique will no longer be a problem, and I need to make sure he pays for everything he's done. This is the least I can do, after all." Clara nodded, her eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide. She knew Lucas was talking about more than just Henry. He was referring to the possibility of them rebuilding something or finally putting an end to everything. Clara felt the weight of her choices more than ever. Lucas went to his lawyer's office, handed over everything he had collected and assured that Enrique would face the legal consequences. The evidence was overwhelming, not only of his involvement with Clara, but of a series of questionable practices that had been harming other people. It was a bitter victory, because Lucas knew that even if Henry was held responsible, the real damage had already been done. He left the office with the knowledge that he had at least done the right thing. Back home, Lucas found Clara in the kitchen, sitting at the table with a cup of tea that was cooling untouched. She looked lost, and he realized that this was the time for the final conversation. He sat across from her, the silence between them almost palpable. Clara was the first to speak, her voice low, full of emotion. "I know I can't ask for anything more from you, Lucas. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, I will accept it. I just want you to find the peace you deserve, even if it means I'm no longer a part of it." Lucas took a deep breath, trying to organize the thoughts that seemed to escape his mind. He knew that this conversation would be final, and he didn't want to leave anything unsaid. "Clara, I spent weeks trying to understand how we got here. Trying to find a reason to keep going, or at least a reason to give up. I don't know if I can forget what happened, but I know I don't want to live with resentment for the rest of my life. I want to move forward, but that doesn't mean we can go back to the way we were before." Clara nodded, her heart heavy at his words. But at the same time, he felt a small spark of hope. He wasn't closing the door completely, and that was more than she expected. In the following days, Lucas and Clara began to share the house almost mechanically, but there was something different in the dynamic. Conversations became more frequent, although they still carried the weight of the past. Lucas realized that, as much as he wanted a quick solution, the healing process was long and required patience. Clara, on the other hand, was willing to prove that she could still be the person Lucas once trusted. She knew it would be a difficult path, but she was determined. Meanwhile, Enrique faced the consequences of his actions. The investigation into his illegal practices intensified, and he was forced to leave his job. His once impeccable reputation was tarnished, and he found himself isolated. For Lucas, this was a small victory, but the real relief came when he realized that he could finally start to put this story behind him. Over time, Lucas began to rediscover parts of himself that he had lost over the years. He picked up hobbies he had abandoned, started spending more time with friends, and even met new people who brought an unexpected freshness to his life. Clara, although present, respected his space, understanding that the reconstruction process was more about Lucas than about her. Months passed, and Lucas finally made a decision. He invited Clara for a conversation in the park where they used to walk in the first years of their marriage. The place brought back good memories, but also a sense of closure. Sitting on a bench, surrounded by the sound of leaves blowing in the wind, Lucas looked at Clara with a lighter expression than she had seen in a long time. "I thought a lot about us, about everything that happened and what I want for the future. And as much as part of me wants to try again, I don't think we can go on. What we had is broken in ways I can't fix. I want you to be happy, Clara, but I think that happiness needs to be far from me." Clara cried, but didn't argue. She knew Lucas was being honest, and deep down, she knew he was right. They said goodbye there, in the park, without rancor, but with the certainty that this was the end of a story that, although painful, had taught them both a lot. Lucas moved on, rediscovering what it meant to be happy with himself. He eventually found a new love, someone who brought lightness and understanding to his life, but who also respected the space he still needed. Clara, in turn, dedicated herself to rebuilding her own life, learning to deal with her mistakes and forgive herself. Enrique disappeared from the social circle he previously frequented, facing the consequences of his choices alone. This story reminds us how betrayal, wrong choices and lies can destroy what seemed solid. She shows us that, no matter how painful it may be, it is possible to find a new beginning, as long as you have the courage to face the truth. If you liked this story, leave your comment below and share your opinion. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. And remember, this channel does not support any type of cheating. Here, we show how poorly made decisions can have irreversible consequences. Until the next story.